Welcome to my study and welcome to Wells Street United Church. My name is Tim. I am the minister of Wells Street Church, and if all has gone well this morning, some of us will already have met and be meeting online, and this is a part of that service. I want to talk to you this morning about the invisible God. Allow me to read to you from Colossians chapter 1 and verses 15 to 20 first of all. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So may God open his word to us and open us up to his word. Nearly 2 weeks ago now, it seems like a long time, I got out early and drove to Stowe, where I took a circular walk around the outside of the grounds of Stowe. And it was a beautiful morning. The sun glinted off the front of Stowe House and quickly warmed the air. The daffodils dazzled and themselves becoming mini suns. The birds sang full of the joys of spring. And it was one of those days when everything seemed right with the world. Except that it wasn't. And as I walked around the perimeter on that lovely day, I reflected that around the world at the moment there is an invisible enemy. It's the foe that we know as coronavirus. The trouble is we can't see it unless we have a very powerful microscope. I read the other day that around 1 billion coronaviruses could fit on a pinhead. It is that small. And being so small and invisible, it's tempting to think that it isn't there or that it won't affect us. Witness the thousands of people that last weekend flocked to beaches and national parks around our country with no regard for social distancing. But just because we can't see it doesn't mean that it isn't there. This vile virus is certainly making its presence known. It is no respecter of rank, as Prince Charles and Boris Johnson have found out. And hundreds of people to this point have lost their lives, and thousands more, tens of thousands around the world. On my walk on that day, I also thought about the invisible God. The Bible tells us that God is the one who made the heavens and the earth. And just because we can't see God doesn't mean that he isn't there. So in Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, the Apostle Paul puts it like this: For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Instinctively, early human beings felt the warmth of the sun and they saw the glory of nature and they believed in a higher power. On my walk, I saw the wonder of the day and the beauty of other days before and since. And it points me towards the Creator God. I can't see him, but that's where creation points me. For some, not seeing God means not believing in God. Or maybe they see the havoc being wrought around the world by COVID-19 and other diseases and evils in the world. And they say, if there is a loving God, why is there so much suffering in the world? And they conclude, there is much suffering in the world, so there cannot be a loving God. What's our answer to this? How can we know and believe in an invisible God? Well, the Bible gives us the answer. John 1 verse 18 tells us, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son who is at the Father's side has made him known. He is in the closest relationship with the Father, and he has made him known. In John 10 verse 30, Jesus says, I and the Father are one. This was such an apparently blasphemous claim that his opponents wanted to stone him there and then. Eventually, they flogged him and crucified him for claiming to be King of the Jews, for allowing people to acclaim him as Messiah and Son of David. And yet, another opponent, a Roman soldier, seeing how he died, blurted out, surely he was the Son of God. Colossians 1 verses 15 and 16, as we've heard, declare of the risen Jesus, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. Well, if all things have been created through him, does that include coronavirus, we might ask? That would be to take one verse of scripture in isolation. Now, you can certainly say that coronavirus has been allowed by Jesus, by God, just as human sin is allowed in the freedom that God's love gives. In the beginning, human beings, male and female, were created in the image of God. We were the pinnacle of God's creation. And yet we know that we've messed up, we have fallen, and we can only blame ourselves for that. Coronavirus is part of the fall, not God's fault, but ours. Yet from the beginning, from before the beginning, the Son is. He's not a created being, but he's known as the firstborn over all creation. And verse 17 in Colossians 1 tells us that he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Maybe at this moment in time, you are only just about holding things together in your life. But know that in Jesus, all things do hold together. Trust him, perhaps like never before, and maybe because that's all that you can do. Verse 18 says of this Son that he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. The Son makes the Father visible. The invisible God is seen in Jesus, in his birth, his life, his teaching, his death, his resurrection. But we cannot see Jesus. Or can we? He is the head of the body, the church. We are the church, people like you and like me. We are his hands, his feet, his body. We are people who can make God visible through our actions. There's a blessing that I sometimes use, and if you're a regular in our congregation, you may have heard me use it. And it goes like this: may you see Jesus in the people that you meet. May you be Jesus to the people that you meet. And really that's a reference to the story of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. And we know that what we do for people in need, we do for Jesus. But then so much of what we want to do at the moment, we can't do because of social distancing. And because there are those who must self-isolate. Yeah, you can't do an awful lot. Maybe self-isolating because of age or underlying health conditions. And it's rather frustrating. How can we be Jesus to others when we can't see others? Well, perhaps this is the time for you to be his ears, listening to one another, his mouth, speaking words of encouragement as you phone, as you Skype, as you Zoom one another. Maybe it's the time to get in touch with old friends and share how your faith is helping you. Last week, I shared how my wife and I had invited our closest neighbours to put a candle in an upstairs window that evening as a prayer for an end to the coronavirus. And 6 out of 8 homes in our close did that. And it was brilliant. Last Thursday, all of us in our close stood at our front doors at 8 p.m. to give a clap of thanks to our NHS workers, and I'm sure that many of you did that too. It seems to me that the invisible God is at work by his Spirit that blows where it wills, and that after so much division caused in our nation by Brexit, he is bringing us back together. Let me take us on to verses 19 and 20 of Colossians 1. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Towards the end of that walk around Stowe, I came across a really delightful scene. A ewe with 2 lambs that had just been born, new life. They tottered towards their mum instinctively, and they latched on to her for her milk, totally dependent upon her and upon what she could give them. Now, God is the God of creation. God is the God of recreation. And in Jesus, he has made a new start and is reconciling all things to himself. In Jesus, we find that God suffers with us. God pours out his love for us. So let's depend upon him all the more at this time. Let's unite in him against our common enemy, coronavirus, and do what it takes. Self-isolation, social distancing, words of kindness, and acts of love. And now may the invisible God, made visible in Jesus, be visible in us by our words and by our actions. Amen.